Part 1. Revelry and Shadows. The streets of New Orleans pulsed with life, a carnival of color and sound as the annual Mardi Gras celebration reached its peak. Beads glittered like treasure in the lamplight, thrown from parade floats to eager hands below. Laughter mixed with the brassy wail of jazz horns, and the scent of fried food and spilled beer mingled in the humid air. Crowds swayed and danced in the revelry, their faces half hidden behind masks of vibrant greens, purples, and golds. Amid the chaos, a vendor stood on a bustling corner, handing out skewers of sizzling meat from his food cart. He wore a patched red hat that cast his features in shadow, and his smile never quite reached his eyes. Few noticed the oddity of his presence, not his unusually pale skin or the faint sheen of sweat that seemed to glisten unnaturally under the streetlights. "Best in town," he called, his voice lilting. "A taste you'll never forget." Revelers grabbed the skewers without hesitation, eager for anything to fuel their endless partying. But those who ate from his cart began to feel strange. At first it was subtle, a growing warmth in their limbs, a dizziness they blamed on the hurricane cocktails. But as the night deepened, those who had sampled the vendor's food began to sway more erratically, their eyes unfocused, their movements sharp and disjointed. In the midst of the celebration, a young woman named Lana ducked into an alley to catch her breath. She was new to New Orleans, her first Mardi Gras feeling like a dream, one where the boundaries between joy and fear blurred. A man stumbled toward her from the alley's shadowed depths, his hand reaching out. His skin was waxy and pallid, his eyes bloodshot. "Help," he rasped. Lana stepped back instinctively, her stomach tightening. She barely had time to react before the man convulsed violently and collapsed. When she reached for her phone, the echo of a scream from the parade route froze her hand mid-motion. The crowd was shifting now, its energy turning erratic. Screams mingled with music as revelers began to push and shove, their colorful masks and costumes suddenly monstrous in the fractured light. A figure stumbled into view, clutching at their stomach as blood seeped through their carnival finery. Lana's breath caught. More people began to collapse, their bodies writhing unnaturally before they rose again, their movements no longer human. The music faltered, replaced by cries of alarm. "Run!" someone shouted, their voice breaking through the growing chaos. The infected lunged, their movements grotesque as they attacked without hesitation. The revelers' laughter and music dissolved into a cacophony of panic, the narrow streets becoming traps as people tripped and shoved against one another in a desperate bid to escape. Lana stood frozen, watching the nightmare unfold. Beads clattered to the ground as people fled, their bright colors stark against the growing pools of crimson. She turned to run, but her escape was cut off by another figure stumbling from the alley. A woman with glassy eyes, her mouth smeared with blood. "Stay away," Lana shouted, her voice trembling, but the woman lunged. Adrenaline surged, and Lana dodged just in time, her heart pounding as she sprinted back toward the main street. The parade floats sat abandoned now, their gaudy decorations grotesque in the flickering lights. Everywhere she looked, the city's vibrant celebration had turned into a tableau of horror. Far ahead, the shadowed vendor stood still, his cart empty. He watched the chaos unfold with an expression that could almost be satisfaction. And then, as if cued by some unseen conductor, the music of the parade resumed. A brassy dirge that echoed eerily through the ravaged streets, underscoring the nightmare with cruel irony. Part 2. Revelry unravels. The frantic cries of the crowd reverberated through the narrow streets of the French Quarter, mingling with the haunting wail of distant trumpets. The Mardi Gras parade was no longer a celebration, but a battleground, the line between attacker and victim dissolving into a chaotic swirl of movement. Lana ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she darted between abandoned floats. Masked figures, some still clutching plastic beads, cowered in shadows or lay motionless in the gutter. Others were not so fortunate, their screams silenced by the feral creatures stalking the streets. The infected were no longer recognizable as the partygoers they once were. Their eyes gleamed with unnatural hunger, their faces twisted into masks of madness. "Help!" someone cried from a nearby balcony. Lana glanced up to see a woman waving frantically. A small group of survivors had barricaded themselves above the street, using makeshift weapons to fend off the infected below. Lana hesitated. She wanted to help, but the infected were closing in on all sides, their jerky, inhuman movements defying logic. A man near the barricade threw a chair from the balcony, striking one of the creatures in the head. It crumpled but rose again moments later, seemingly unfazed. "No time," Lana whispered to herself, forcing her legs to keep moving. She rounded a corner and stumbled into another pocket of chaos. Here the infected swarmed over a float decorated with oversized masks and glittering feathers. Survivors trapped atop it screamed as the creatures clawed their way up the sides, their grotesque faces illuminated by strobe lights still flickering from the float's display. Something cold brushed Lana's hand, and she whirled around. A man in a tattered jester costume staggered toward her, his painted face smeared with blood, his fingers twitching unnaturally. She ducked, narrowly avoiding his grasp, and grabbed a broken broomstick from the ground. Swinging wildly, she struck him across the head, the blow sending him sprawling. The makeshift weapon splintered in her hands. She cursed under her breath and turned to flee, only to collide with a wiry young man carrying a fire extinguisher. He steadied her, his brown eyes wide with terror, but alive with determination. "Follow me," he barked, pulling her down a side street. Lana obeyed without question, the sound of pursuit growing fainter as they weaved through the maze of alleyways. Finally, they ducked into a narrow courtyard, surrounded by wrought iron gates and draped in the shadow of a centuries-old oak tree. The man bent over, hands on his knees, catching his breath. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough. "No," Lana managed, leaning against the tree. "What's going on? What are those things?" "People," he said grimly. "Or they were. Something's turning them. Some kind of infection. It's spreading fast." "Who are you?" Lana asked, still clutching the broken broomstick like a lifeline. "Leo," he replied, straightening. "And you?" "Lana." She scanned the courtyard, her senses still on high alert. "Do you know what caused this?" Leo shook his head. "No, but I saw a food vendor earlier, acting off. A lot of people who got sick ate from his cart." Lana's stomach twisted. "I saw him too. He didn't seem normal." Before Leo could respond, a low growl echoed from the alley they had come through. Both turned as an infected figure staggered into view, its movements unnervingly rapid. It was joined by another, then another, their collective presence a horrifying reminder of the danger they faced. "This way," Leo hissed, leading Lana through a rusted gate on the far side of the courtyard. They emerged into another alley, this one darker and narrower. The sound of pursuit was growing louder, the infected relentless in their hunt. As they ran, the wail of the parade music seemed to grow louder, a macabre soundtrack to their flight. The narrow streets funneled them toward a dimly lit jazz club with boarded-up windows. Leo shoved open the door, motioning for Lana to follow. Inside, the room was dimly lit by candles and an old jukebox, humming faintly in the corner. A group of survivors, huddled together, looked up as they entered. Their faces were gaunt and pale, a mixture of exhaustion and fear etched into their features. "You brought more trouble," an older man growled, gripping a length of pipe like a club. "No, she's clean," Leo said quickly, closing the door and bracing it with a chair. "We need to stay quiet. They're close." Lana surveyed the room. There were maybe 10 people, ranging from a middle-aged woman clutching her rosary to a teen boy wearing a sequined cape. They all looked to Leo for guidance. "How long have you been here?" Lana asked softly. "Since it started," said the woman with the rosary. "We thought we could wait it out, but it's not safe anywhere." The air was thick with tension and the acrid smell of sweat and fear. Lana's heart pounded as she leaned against the wall, trying to process the nightmare unraveling around her. The pounding on the door came moments later, followed by the guttural groans of the infected. The survivors scrambled into action, barricading windows and readying their meager weapons. As Lana gripped her splintered broomstick, she noticed something strange. A faint, smoky haze filtering through the cracks in the walls. Her throat tightened, and her lungs burned as she gasped for air. "They're not just outside," she choked. "It's in the air." Leo's eyes widened. "The infection, it's spreading through the air now." The pounding on the door grew louder, the barricade buckling under the assault. Outside, the infected wailed, their cries mingling with the eerie notes of the parade music, which seemed to echo from everywhere at once. Part 3. Trapped in the jazz club. The jazz club's dim interior was stifling, the air thick with panic and smoke like haze that burned the lungs. Outside, the infected clawed and slammed against the door, their guttural groans mixing with the macabre melody of the distant parade. The survivors pressed against the walls, their faces etched with terror. Lana tightened her grip on the broken broomstick. "We can't stay here. The infection, it's in the air." The middle-aged woman with the rosary crossed herself, her lips trembling. "How do you fight the air? God help us." Leo paced near the barricaded door, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "If it's airborne now, we need masks, filters, anything to slow it down." "Even if we had them," Lana countered, "how long can we last? There's no food, no water. Those things are just going to keep coming." "Quiet," snapped the older man with the pipe, his leathery face turned toward the barricade. "You're going to draw them in faster with all your yammering." A loud crash punctuated his words as part of the barricade buckled. Splinters of wood flew into the room, and one infected figure clawed through the gap, its milky eyes scanning hungrily. The older man reacted first, swinging his pipe with brutal force. The creature's head snapped back, but it continued its frenzied attack, its arms flailing wildly through the broken barricade. "Everyone, move!" Leo shouted, grabbing a chair and slamming it against the door. The survivors scrambled to reinforce the barricade, using anything they could find: tables, chairs, even a battered jukebox. Lana helped shove a heavy speaker against the door, sweat dripping down her face. The infected outside were relentless, their pounding growing louder and more frenzied with each passing moment. "This won't hold for long," Leo said, his voice tight with urgency. He turned to the group. "We need a plan, an escape route." A young man in a glittery cape spoke up, his voice trembling. "There's a back door in the storage room. It leads to the alley." The older man shook his head. "And right into another trap. You think the streets are any safer?" "They'll break through eventually," Lana snapped. "We either take our chances out there or die in here." The survivors exchanged uncertain glances, fear battling with the primal urge to survive. Finally, Leo made the call. "We move, now." He led the way to the storage room, the group huddling behind him. The small, cluttered space smelled of mildew and spilled liquor. A metal door stood at the far end, its surface scratched and dented but intact. "Help me with this," Leo said, motioning to Lana. Together they worked to pry open the rusted lock with a crowbar they found among the clutter. The groans of the infected grew louder, closer. The barricade wouldn't hold much longer. "Hurry," the woman with the rosary whispered urgently. With a screech of metal, the door swung open, revealing the narrow alley beyond. The cold night air hit them like a slap, bringing with it the acrid stench of decay. The infected were nearby, too nearby, but the alley was momentarily clear. "Go," Leo hissed, ushering the group through the door. Lana stayed close to his side, her broken broomstick held like a talisman against the darkness. The survivors moved quickly, their footsteps echoing in the enclosed space. The alley twisted and turned, a labyrinth of brick walls and dumpsters, each shadow a potential hiding place for danger. The groans of the infected echoed from all directions, a chilling reminder that they were far from safe. As they rounded a corner, a group of infected appeared ahead, their figures illuminated by the flickering light of a broken street lamp. The creatures turned toward the survivors, their movements unnaturally fast. "Run!" Leo shouted. The group scattered, panic overriding coordination. Lana sprinted after Leo, her lungs burning as she tried to keep up. Behind them, the infected gave chase, their grotesque forms moving with terrifying speed. A sudden scream cut through the night. Lana glanced back to see the woman with the rosary dragged down by two infected. Her cries were silenced in seconds, and Lana forced herself to look away, the horror twisting in her chest. "Don't stop," Leo yelled, grabbing her arm and pulling her forward. They burst out of the alley onto a deserted street. Mardi Gras decorations fluttered in the breeze, and discarded beads littered the ground like mocking remnants of the celebration. Ahead, the towering shadow of a cathedral loomed, its dark spires cutting into the night sky. "This way," Leo said, pulling Lana toward the cathedral. The remaining survivors followed, their faces pale with exhaustion and terror. The heavy wooden doors of the cathedral groaned as they pushed inside. The interior was vast and dimly lit by the moonlight, filtering through shattered stained glass windows. Rows of pews stretched into the darkness, and the scent of wax and incense mingled with the coppery tang of blood. Leo slammed the doors shut and slid a wooden beam into place, sealing them inside. The group collapsed onto the cold stone floor, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. For a moment there was silence, save for the faint pounding of the infected against the outside walls. Lana looked around, her mind racing. They had escaped the immediate threat, but the air inside the cathedral felt heavy, oppressive, as if the building itself bore witness to their doom. From the shadows of the altar, a faint sound emerged, a low, rhythmic humming. Lana froze, her skin prickling with unease. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. The others fell silent, their eyes darting to the darkened corners of the cathedral. The humming grew louder, more distinct, until it formed a melody, haunting and discordant, like the twisted echo of a hymn. Something moved in the shadows. Part 4. The Haunting Cathedral. The survivors huddled together in the cavernous cathedral, their breaths shallow and uneven. The haunting melody echoed through the darkened halls, growing louder with each passing moment. It was no hymn. It was dissonant and unnatural, like the cry of something ancient and inhuman. "Who's there?" Leo called, his voice breaking the tense silence. He held a broken candlestick in one hand, his knuckles white as he scanned the shadows near the altar. The answer came not in words, but in movement. From the darkness, shapes began to emerge, shambling figures whose presence chilled the air. At first they appeared like the infected outside, their decayed bodies moving unnaturally. But as they drew closer, the flickering moonlight revealed their faces, pale, sunken, and twisted into grotesque parodies of religious devotion. "Dear God," someone whispered. The woman clutching her rosary had said it, her voice trembling. "These aren't the same," Lana said, gripping her broken broomstick tightly. "They're different." The figures moved with a purpose, their empty eyes locked on the survivors. They were silent, save for the scraping of their bare feet against the cold stone floor, their movements almost ritualistic as they advanced. "What do we do?" the boy in the glittery cape whispered, his face pale with terror. Leo's jaw tightened. "We fight." Before anyone could argue, the first of the creatures lunged. Leo swung the candlestick, connecting with a sickening crack, but the figure barely staggered. It reached for him with clawed fingers, forcing him to backpedal. The others joined the fight, using whatever they could as weapons. Lana thrust the splintered broomstick into the chest of one creature, and it let out a low, guttural moan before collapsing. She had little time to process this small victory, as another creature lunged at her, its decayed face inches from hers. "Get down!" Leo shouted. Lana dropped to the floor just as he swung his candlestick, the blow sending the creature sprawling. The survivors fought valiantly, but the creatures seemed endless. For every one they felled, two more emerged from the shadows. The oppressive melody grew louder, reverberating through the cathedral and seeping into their bones. "This isn't working," Lana cried as she dodged another attack. "We have to find a way out." "There's no other exit," Leo shouted back, his voice strained. "We're trapped." As the fight continued, the melody reached a fever pitch, and the creatures began to move faster, their jerky movements becoming almost fluid. Lana's heart pounded as she realized the truth. The melody was driving them, fueling their strength. "The music, it's controlling them," she shouted. "We have to stop it." Leo's eyes darted to the altar, where the sound seemed strongest. "Cover me," he yelled, breaking away from the fight and sprinting toward the source of the unholy melody. Lana followed, her instincts screaming at her to stay close. Together they reached the altar, where a massive, ancient organ loomed. Its pipes stretched toward the vaulted ceiling, and the keys seemed to play themselves, moving under an invisible hand. "What is this?" Lana breathed, her voice trembling. "Doesn't matter," Leo said, hefting his candlestick. "We end it." With a primal yell, he swung the makeshift weapon at the organ's keys. The impact reverberated through the room, and the music faltered. The creatures paused mid-lunge, their heads twitching as if confused. "Keep going," Lana urged. Leo struck again, this time smashing several keys completely. The melody became a chaotic mess of discordant notes, and the creatures writhed in agony, their bodies convulsing. "It's working," Lana shouted, grabbing a heavy candelabra and slamming it into the organ's pipes. The metallic clang echoed through the cathedral, and the melody collapsed into silence. For a moment, everything was still. The creatures stood motionless, their empty eyes staring into nothingness. Then, one by one, they crumpled to the floor, their bodies dissolving into ash-like dust. The survivors looked around in stunned silence, their weapons hanging limply at their sides. The oppressive atmosphere in the cathedral lifted, replaced by an eerie calm. "We did it," Leo said, his voice barely above a whisper. But the victory was short-lived. A deep, resonant sound filled the air, a low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the very walls. The temperature plummeted, and the faint glow of the moonlight dimmed. "What now?" Lana asked, her voice shaking. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and a crack appeared in the stone floor, spreading outward from the altar. From the depths of the earth came a blinding light, accompanied by an ear-splitting roar. Leo grabbed Lana's arm. "We need to get out of here now." The survivors sprinted toward the cathedral doors, throwing aside the wooden beam and wrenching them open. Outside, the infected were gone, but the city was bathed in an unnatural light, the air vibrating with an ominous energy. The group stumbled onto the street, gasping for breath. Behind them, the cathedral groaned as its spires began to collapse, stone by stone. "What's happening?" the boy in the cape asked, his voice trembling. Lana stared at the crumbling structure, her heart pounding. "I think we woke something up." From the wreckage of the cathedral came a sound that froze them in their tracks, a low, guttural growl, followed by a burst of light that illuminated the city in a ghostly glow. The survivors turned and ran, their shadows stretching long behind them as the nightmare continued to unfold. Part 5. The Last Parade. The city of New Orleans lay transformed. What had been a vibrant celebration of life now resembled a warped purgatory. The once colorful streets shimmered with an unnatural glow, and the festive decorations hung limp like the remnants of a forgotten dream. The survivors sprinted through the desolation, their shadows dancing erratically in the eerie light emanating from the ruined cathedral. Behind them, the earth split wider, and a monstrous form began to emerge from the rubble. It was massive, its hulking shape barely discernible through the billowing dust and blinding light. Its guttural roar shook the ground, a sound so deep it resonated in the survivors' bones. "Keep running," Leo shouted, pulling Lana along as the remaining survivors scattered in different directions. "But where?" Lana cried, her voice breaking. She glanced over her shoulder at the looming figure, its glowing eyes cutting through the darkness. "We find higher ground!" Leo yelled back, his voice filled with desperation. "Somewhere defensible." The roar behind them deepened, and the light from the cathedral intensified, casting grotesque shadows across the French Quarter. Buildings groaned and crumbled as the force emanating from the creature ripped through the city like an unholy storm. The survivors found themselves back on the parade route, the floats now lifeless hulks draped in shredded garlands and smeared with blood. The music had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence punctuated only by the distant cries of those still fighting to survive. Leo skidded to a halt near an overturned float, shaped like a giant masquerade mask. He grabbed Lana by the shoulders, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "We need to figure this out," he said. "That thing, whatever it is, it's not stopping until it destroys everything." "What can we do?" Lana asked, her voice cracking. "We barely survived the infected." Leo's gaze hardened. "There's always a way. We just have to find it." A sudden burst of light cut through the gloom, and the ground quaked beneath their feet. The creature had fully emerged from the cathedral's ruins, its massive form illuminated by the unnatural glow. It was an amalgamation of flesh and shadow, its grotesque limbs stretching impossibly long as it lumbered toward the survivors. Its gaping maw emitted a sound that was neither roar nor scream, but something far more primal and terrifying. "Go!" Leo shouted, pushing Lana forward. "We'll think later, just move." They ran, weaving through the wreckage of floats and barricades. Each step was a battle against the shaking ground and the oppressive heat radiating from the creature. The streets seemed to twist and stretch, as if the city itself was warping in the wake of the monstrosity. Suddenly, Lana stopped, her eyes widening. "Wait," she cried, grabbing Leo's arm. "The vendor." "What?" Leo asked, breathless. "The food vendor," Lana said, her voice urgent. "This started with him. He wasn't normal. If we can find him, maybe we can figure out how to stop this." Leo hesitated, then nodded. "It's a long shot, but it's all we've got." Together they turned back toward the main square, where the parade had started. The journey was harrowing. The creature's roars echoed through the streets, and the city seemed to writhe under its destructive presence. They avoided the infected that still roamed, their numbers thinned but their movements more erratic and desperate. When they reached the square, it was almost unrecognizable. The decorations hung in tatters, and the ornate fountain at its center had collapsed into rubble. But standing in the middle of the devastation, untouched by the chaos, was the vendor. He no longer looked human. His pale skin shimmered with an otherworldly sheen, and his eyes glowed with the same unnatural light as the creature. He smiled as they approached, his expression serene, almost inviting. "You've come far," he said, his voice resonant and inhuman, "but there is no stopping what has been set in motion." "What did you do?" Lana demanded, stepping forward despite her trembling hands. "What is this?" The vendor tilted his head, his smile widening. "A cleansing, a rebirth. You mortals cling to your fragile lives, blind to the rot that consumes your world. This is the beginning of something greater." Leo raised his makeshift weapon, his face grim. You started this. You're going to end it. The vendor chuckled, the sound echoing unnaturally. End it. You cannot end what has already begun. But perhaps you wish to join the new world. With a flick of his wrist, the vendor summoned a wave of the glowing haze. It rushed toward them like a living thing, its touch burning the air. Lana and Leo dove behind the remnants of a float, narrowly avoiding the deadly mist. There has to be a way, Lana whispered, her mind racing. She glanced at the vendor, at the faint shimmer of light that surrounded him like an aura. He's connected to it somehow. If we can break that connection, Leo nodded, understanding instantly. We take him out. They emerged from their cover, moving in tandem. Lana grabbed a discarded parade torch, its flame still flickering weakly, while Leo charged with his candlestick. The vendor raised his hand, another wave of haze rushing toward them, but this time they didn't falter. Lana hurled the torch with all her strength. It struck the vendor's chest, the flames catching on his shimmering skin. He howled, his serene mask breaking into a snarl of rage. Leo took the opportunity to close the distance, swinging his weapon with brutal force. The connection broke in an instant. The glowing haze dissipated, and the oppressive energy lifted. The creature in the distance let out a final, mournful roar before collapsing into itself, its massive form disintegrating into ash. The city fell silent. Lana and Leo stood amidst the wreckage, their chests heaving. Around them, the surviving revelers began to emerge, their faces pale and haunted. The nightmare had ended, but the scars it left would not fade easily. As dawn broke over New Orleans, the streets glimmered not with beads and confetti, but with the ashes of the fallen. The survivors gathered in the square, their silence heavier than the destruction around them. For Lana and Leo, the victory was hollow, but it was a victory nonetheless. They had survived the last parade, but the echoes of its horrors would remain with them forever.